Here we go. Okay, very good. So everyone here is muted who's online. If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. It's quite all right, as well as I offer the same to those who are here in person. By all means, if you have a question, comment, or rebuttal, feel free to make a comment. Feel free to ask any question. Um, you have in front of you here locally a handout, and those at home are looking at a handout that's being shared with them. It's on their screen, and I'll try to keep on top of people as they enter into the chat room. But let's get going. We're actually going to be skipping the first part, and we're going to sort of just reversing the order. If we have a little bit of time, maybe we'll come back to the beginning. But let's talk more about Parshas Ve'era. Now, I know that Parshas Ve'era is last week's Parsha. We read it already. And if you're coming to a class that's about the Parsha, you probably want to hear about this coming week. But there's actually something about Parshas Ve'era, at least the topic that I want to be discussing, that is also appropriate, and it also has bearing on Parshas Bo because they many of the same themes and same ideas. Most notably, the continuation of the plagues comes up, and that's really going to be what we're going to be asking and what we're going to be discussing. And the question that we're asking is, what exactly is the purpose of all the plagues? When we read through last week's Parsha of Ve'era and this coming week's Parsha of Parshas Bo, we really find a country that is beleaguered, a country that has been brutalized. It's experienced the absolute worst of what any country could experience. Its crops have been consumed by locusts. It's had everything else destroyed by hail. Everyone is experiencing boils, blisters. There are lice everywhere. All of their water turned to blood. It's an awful, a horrible time for the Egyptians. And everyone could see that Egypt has been brought to its knees. In fact, we read about I believe it's in Parshas Bo, where Moshe says to Paro at one point, "Let my people go," and Paro says, "No." And so Moshe leaves, and all of a sudden, Paro's courtiers come to him and they say, "How long are you going to allow the Jewish people to be a snare, to be a trap for us? They're going to cause us to stumble. Don't you see that Egypt is lost?" It's obvious Egypt has lost. It's obvious to all the Egyptians and Paro's own court. The only person who just seems to be stubborn about this is Paro. So apparently the plagues have achieved their aim. If the purpose of the plagues was to ensure or to force the subjugation of the Egyptians and to enable the Jewish people to go free, then seemingly, apparently, the plagues have been successful. However, we can ask a very simple question, and that is, why was it necessary for all of this turmoil? Why was it necessary for all of this destruction? Couldn't Hashem have just, perhaps put the Egyptians to sleep for a week and have the Jewish people walk out free without any destruction, without any damage, without anyone suffering? Wouldn't that have achieved the goal or the aim in just as effective a way? Why was it necessary for so many people to suffer? And by the end, with Makas Bechoros, with the affliction of the plague of the firstborn, why was it necessary for people to die? And that's the question we're going to be asking, that we're going to attempt to answer. What exactly was the enterprise of the plagues? Why were they necessary? What were they there to achieve? We can also perhaps, strengthen the question. You could take a look at what source is this over here? Just trying to see it. Source 10. On source 10, those of you at home, you can see it's sort of on the smack in the middle of the page. You also see that Hashem hardens Paro's heart. And this is especially true for the final 4 or 5 makos. And you see this here repeated several times. God hardened the heart of Paro so that Paro didn't listen to them. I have hardened his heart, Hashem says to Moshe. And God hardened Paro's heart, and he did not let the Bnei Yisrael go free. So we see that this is repeated numerous times, and it's a very, very puzzling point, to note. The plagues are obviously achieving something. They're there to accomplish some kind of goal. It was necessary for Paro to be fortified to the degree that he did not succumb to the pressures that the plagues brought. So again, this sort of reinforces the question. It sort of adds a dimension to it. The plagues were obviously necessary. We had to experience, or the Egyptians had to experience, all 10 of them. What exactly was the aim? What exactly was the mission? And again, traditionally, it's about simply letting the Jewish people go free. But if that's the only purpose, if that's the only goal, well, then seemingly these 10 plagues are unnecessary. Paro's heart didn't have to be hardened. Just he could have just let the Jewish people go free. If that was the entire goal, why was his heart hardened? So, what was the purpose of the 10 plagues? The text of the Torah seems to indicate that the purpose behind the plagues was not only to affect the freedom of the Jewish people, but it was educational in its nature as well. If you take a look at source 11, here you see it very clearly laid out. We see here in the Hebrew, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. Hashem said to Moshe, Bo el Paro, go or come to Paro. Ki ani hichbaditi es libo, because I have hardened his heart, ve'eslev avodav, as well as the heart of his servants, laman shisi ososai ela bikirbo. And there's perhaps I should have highlighted this, perhaps I should have underlined this, but he says, what is the purpose? Why is it necessary for these plagues to happen? Why did I harden Paro's heart? Well, so that I should place these signs in their midst. And he continues, laman tesaper be'ozne vincha uven bincha es asher hisalalti b'mitzrayim, so that you should recount in the ears of your children and your grandchildren that mockery that I have performed amongst the Egyptians. Ve'es oso sai asher samti vam, as well as the signs that I have placed in them. Again, here the focus is on pedagogy. It's about teaching children. And then here, this is highlighted on the English side, anyways. Bidatem ki ani Hashem. This is so that you will know that I am the Lord. So what's the stated goal here? What is the purpose here? The purpose is so that we can tell future generations about the power of God. The ultimate purpose is, as we say at the very end, so that we should know God. Bidatem ki ani Hashem, and you will know that I am God. The Bnei Yisrael here are witnessing an incredible spectacle. It's something that is meant to forge in their hearts belief in Hashem. They need to have the understanding of God implanted in their heart, an understanding that incorporates or that encompasses that God has the ability to harness both natural and supernatural forces. This moment of realization, when the Bnei Yisrael become cognizant of the nature of Hashem and the relationship that they have with Him, is a moment of knowing God. And it's so that we should educate and teach future generations about what it means to know God and what does it mean to understand who and what omnipotent power God has. So Nachmanides, the Ramban, who's a 13th century Spanish authority, he takes this idea a bit further. So if you take a look here on the screen in front of you, or those of you at home, this is source number 12, which is on the top of the second paragraph on page 4. Let's read and see what it is that the Ramban, that Nachmanides says. He says, I will now state a general principle which lies at the foundation of several mitzvos, several commandments. Since the introduction of idolatry into the world, the attitudes of people as regards matters of faith have become confused and have diverged from true beliefs. Some people believe that the world has been in existence eternally with no creation. This is a reference to their Aristotelian belief that the world was never created, the world always was. And that was in vogue in the days of the Ramban and the Rambam, who was a bit older than him. The Rambam, Maimonides, he most famously wrote the Moreh Nevuchim, which is the Guide to the Perplexed, which is an attempt to align Torah thought according to Aristotelian logic and philosophy. But here he's alluding to this idea that Aristotle had, and which this was the preeminent belief at the time. There wasn't any creation; the world has always existed. So he says that it was necessary for the Torah to lay out, or for the people to experience Yetzias Mitzrayim, or the exodus from Egypt, as we're about to see, because there are many beliefs that predominate within the world around us. Others feel that God exists, but he does not know the ways of man. That's Plutonic. That's the way Pluto thought of the mover and shaker, the creator of the cosmos. And that there is neither reward nor punishment. They say, and he's quoting here from the prophet Yechezkel, God has departed from the earth. When God performs a miracle in sight of a desirable collective or individual, a miracle that will affect a change in the laws of nature, these false attitudes of faith will be disproved in the most clearest of ways. For the miracle demonstrates God's mastery over the world, his creation, and his knowledge of and involvement in its affairs. Additionally, when a particular miracle is preceded by a prophetic announcement, the existence of prophecy, the idea that God speaks with man and tells him his secrets, will be proven, and this in turn will prove the truth of the entire Torah. So, taking a step back, according to the Ramban, miracles manage to transform a philosophical truth into a living belief. A person who experiences a miracle will be convinced that God is powerful. And it will also indicate, at least from how we see these miracles are transpiring, that God interferes and God is involved in the affairs of man. God created the universe. That is proven by the fact that he can affect the nature of the universe. And we also see that God punishes the wicked, rewards the righteous, and will involve himself in the affairs of man. I guess it's entirely refutes many of the philosophical points that stand in opposition to what it is that Jews believe. So if we're going to perhaps read this Ramban in its historical context, we should appreciate that the Bnei Yisrael are at a fundamental nexus. They're at the very beginning, the very formation of their development. They're about to become a nation. They're about to be birthed as Am Yisrael. And at the birth of their nation, it's necessary that as they emerge independent, as they emerge as a nation in charge of its own affairs, that it has to be born in the crucible of faith. They have to experience God in the most incredible, immediate, and direct way in order to form a bedrock, a philosophical, theological foundation, an understanding of who and what God is. A, God is creator. B, God is involved in the affairs of man. And God punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. It was necessary for us to experience this right then and right there as we emerged as a nation, so that these lessons will be imprinted on the Jewish people at that time, but they will also be perpetuated in future generations as well, as he says as we continue. So let's continue on in the text. Let me scroll down for those of you at home. Seeing that God will not perform a sign or miracle in each and every generation in the presence of any heretic or evildoer, he commands us to continually create memorials and signs to that which we saw with our own eyes. Thus, we reproduce these events to our children, and they to their children, until the very last generation. The Torah was very particular about this matter. And he writes and he gives some examples. What does it say? And the Torah commands us to write about these miracles on our hands and between our eyes. That's a reference to tefillin. In the tefillin scrolls that we bind to our hands and we bind to our heads, there is included there references to Yetzias Mitzrayim, to the exodus of Egypt. We're instructed to write this on our doorposts. That's in the mezuzos. The mezuzos also talk about the exodus from Egypt. And we mention them both morning and in the evening as part of the Shema. And that we build a sukkah each year. And we always say, as we bless the sukkah, as we say Kiddush in the sukkah, we say Zecher Liyetzias Mitzrayim, a remembrance, a commemoration of the exodus from Egypt. So if a single miracle has the ability to engender belief and faith in God, then all the more so 10 miracles are able to do so. And in order to ensure that there's a preservation of these philosophical and theological concepts that we believe as Jews, we perpetuate their remembrance every single day, all the time, by binding them to our body, attaching them to our doorposts, and by reciting them morning and the evening. These are religious acts that are meant to commemorate this incredible monumental event, Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is intended to, base or to deeply root these beliefs in ourselves. And because, as the Ramban says, miracles can't happen in every generation, we have to preserve that moment of exaltation and ensure that that is passed on, and we do so through so many of the mitzvahs, the commandments that we have. So according to this idea, according to the Ramban, the purpose of the plagues was not just to affect the Exodus, not just to ensure that the Jewish people leave Egypt or to enable them to leave Egypt. It also served an educational purpose as well, an educational purpose to the Jews who lived at that time. And we ensure that those lessons are passed on in how we live our everyday Jewish life through the daily rituals of reciting the Shema, putting on tefillin, and having mezuzahs on our doorposts, but also through the calendar year as we observe on Pesach, when we are eating matzah, commemorating the exodus from Egypt, how we left Egypt, and how we sit in a sukkah, also remembering how it was that in the desert, upon our departure from Egypt, we resided in tents, and so on and so forth. We ensure that these lessons are perpetuated and remain within the Jewish people. They're taught to our children and become core to our identity as Jews and our concepts, our conceptualization of Hashem. But it is also possible that there is another audience for the plagues. It's possible that the plagues were not only for the Jewish people, but for a different group, a different cohort as well. And we'll explain. Now, if we take a look here, and I'll pull out this graph, but it's immediately preceded by a mnemonic, right? At the Pesach Seder, we say in the name of Rabbi Yehuda that he would recount the 10 plagues and he would divide them into groups. Does anybody recall offhand, if you're not necessarily looking at the sheet, and if you are, what exactly is it that he says about the 10 plagues? What does he call the 10 plagues? He calls them Ditzach Adash Be'achav. He has a formula. It's a mnemonic. It's a way of remembering all the 10 plagues. Ditzach is made up of the first letter of the first 3 plagues, Dam Tzfardei Akinim, blood for frogs and lice. Adash is made up of the first letters of the subsequent 3 plagues, wild animals, orov, pestilence, dever, and boils, which is shchin. And Be'achav is made up of the final 4. We're going to sort of just ignore the plague of the firstborn for just a moment and focus on the hail, locusts, and darkness. So obviously we see that Rabbi Yehuda divides the plagues into 3 specific groupings. Why not 2 groups of 5? Why specifically 3 groups of 3, ignoring the Makas Bechoros, ignoring the final plague? Why did he specifically choose this formula to unify specific plagues together into a specific group? And we also see that that's actually borne out. If you were to take a look at the text of the Torah, and it's clearly laid out before you here, not the words, but in a chart in source number 15. Let me put this person in. You see that there's a very specific order to the plagues. Let's take a look. So you have all the plagues all the way on the left-hand column. You see them listed 1 through 9, and you also see that they're color-coded. I've taken Rabbi Yehuda's mnemonic, where he divides them into 3 groups of 3, and you see that they're color-coded. And you also see that there's a recurring pattern. The plagues are obviously and quite clearly grouped in groups of 3. We can view each one of these groups as a wave of plagues. In each wave, the first 2 plagues are preceded by a divine forewarning. As you can see on the next column, this column that's second to the left, where you see that there's a warning. You have the first 2 of each wave have a warning, and the final one is is just sort of launched without any kind of warning to Paro. You also see that each the structure of the warnings or the instructions to Moshe are also in a recurring pattern. You see, for example, in verses 14 through 24, station yourself in the morning. Then in verse 25 to the chapter 8, 11, go to Paro. And then you see that there's no warning. Then you see that the same instructions are repeated. Station yourself in the morning, followed by go to Paro, and then there's no warning. And then you see that Hashem says finally again, station yourself in the morning. Then it's followed by go to Paro, and then nothing again. So we also see that there's a cyclic rhythm to how Moshe is being instructed to interact with Paro. So we obviously see that there is something that groups each one of these waves together. There's something about each one of these waves that is differentiated from the other. So what exactly is the message here? How exactly are these plagues being being carried out? Why was all of this necessary? So it's interesting to note that there are some features from within the structure of the descriptions of these plagues, and we'll explain. When we take a look, for example, at the first three plagues, Dam, Tzfardea, and Kinin, you have blood, frogs, and lice. In the story, in the Torah, Moshe is interacting with Paro, but there are another group of people who are a participant in this interaction as well. Who are they? The magicians, right? Paro's court advisors, his religious officiants, they are present as well. They're able to reproduce some of them, but not all of them. They are only present here for the first three plagues, but they do not show up again afterwards. And what do they declare at the end of the first wave of plagues? Etzba Elokim. This is the finger of God. The magicians, the Paro's court religious officiants, they declare God is here, God is involved, because we cannot rationalize this or replicate it ourselves. Then we have the second wave of plagues. We have beasts, which is Arov, we have pestilence, which is Dever, and then we have boils. What marks these plagues? What makes them different than the other plagues? Well, in all of these plagues here, a very clear boundary is being made between the Jewish people and the Egyptians. For example, when it comes to the wild animals, Hashem tells Moshe, tell Paro that I'm going to create a boundary, I'm going to create a separation between the land of the Jews in Goshen and where the Egyptians are, because there will be this wild horde of animals that's coming and it's wreaking havoc, and it will not affect where the Jews live. This again is repeated with the second plague of the second wave and with pestilence, where Hashem says, I will strike your livestock, but I will not strike the livestock of the Jewish people. And in fact, Paro sends agents or spies, people to go stake out the Jewish neighborhoods and see, is there a pestilence? Are the Jewish animals dying? And he's told no. Then we have the third plague over here. It's also there's a distinction, there's a difference that's being made. The Egyptians suffered from the boils, the Jews did not. And then finally, we have a third wave, which is hail, locusts, and darkness. There's something that's specific about this wave as well. Before Hashem sends each one of these plagues, Hashem says, this will be like nothing you have ever seen before, and nothing like any one of your ancestors have ever seen, even using such language as, from the day that the earth has been formed until now, until this point, nothing like this has ever happened. That happens with hail, that happens with locusts, and obviously that happens with darkness as well. According to Chazal, Rashi lays this out. The darkness was so thick that people could not move. That's highly unusual. Darkness is normally conceptualized as the absence of light. There's no substance there that stops people from moving, but this darkness was different. Again, so we see that there are themes to each one of these plagues. We start off that with interacting with the Egyptians, they admit, yeah, there's a God here who's involved. Then we have the next group of plagues. We see that God is differentiating between the Egyptians and the Jews. And then finally, God is demonstrating that there is no one like God. So we've seen that these plagues come in waves, and we have also discussed some of their unifying themes. So, what exactly is the point of all this? Where exactly are we going with all this? Well, again, the themes are, I am the Lord is the first for the first group. I'm the Lord in the midst of the land that distinguishes between that involves myself in the affairs of man. And then finally, we have the third wave that talks about there being none like me. So God here is teaching Paro some very important theological lessons. There are three theological lessons that he wants to impart to Paro. If you think back to Paro's initial interaction with Moshe, Moshe says to Paro, let my people go. Paro says, I don't know who God is. I don't know who you are. And because I don't know God and I don't know who God is, therefore I will not let the Jewish people go. I'm paraphrasing, but he uses almost exactly that terminology. So the three waves here come to educate Paro very, very elegantly. The first wave comes to say, you say that there's no God, here I am. Even your own religious officiants will say, yep, God's here. Well, maybe you'll say, okay, well, God is this transcendent entity who perhaps might exist, but he doesn't necessarily interject himself into the affairs of man. There's no divine providence. Why would God punish me and let the slaves go free? That makes no sense. Well, now God comes in, gets involved, and says, that's not exactly how it works. I do judge the wicked and I do reward the righteous. Well, Paro says, well, maybe God does exist and maybe God does involve himself in the affairs of man. Okay, well, that doesn't preclude other gods being here, and maybe my Egyptian gods are more powerful than this slave god. To which God articulates to Paro, now you should know that there are none like me. So the three lessons come to address Paro's mockery. There is no Lord. I do not know God. Therefore, I will not let him go. Here, the interaction between Hashem and through Moshe and Paro comes to educate Paro about the fallacy of his assertion. So that also explains why it was necessary for Paro to be locked into this position, not being able to, decide to let the Jewish people go, having his heart hardened by God. However, we're going to explain that. It was necessary for that to play out so that these educational lessons could be made, not only to the Jewish people, but also to Paro himself. So that explains the first 9 plagues. Let's talk about the plague of the firstborn. We discussed the possibility of God bringing a single plague that would deal a decisive blow, which would activate the freedom of the Bnei Israel. And we can now comprehend that God had a different plan in mind. There was an educational or pedagogical operation. The plagues were not punitive. They were not operational. They were there to be educational. But it would seem that the final plague, the plague of the death of the firstborn, does not fit into this educational model or educational role, but it fits a different category. The killing of the firstborn was always meant to be that plague that set the Jewish people free. Let's take a look. I'm not sure I included this pasuk at the end. No, I did not. Let me read to you the pasuk. This is a pasuk from Parshas. I do not believe it's in Va'era. I believe it's in Parshat Shmos, where at the very beginning, Moshe is told, go down to Egypt. He rejects the mission, but finally he accepts it. He goes to his father-in-law, Yisro, and then says, okay, I'm going to go down to Egypt. And Hashem communicates with him one more time before he sets off for this task. And what does he say? Go say to Paro, Israel is my firstborn son. Let that my son go that he may worship me. Yet you will refuse to let him go. Now I will slay your firstborn son. The plague of the firstborn from the initial enterprise was always ready to be that plague that set the Bnei Yisrael free. This was supposed to be the blow that would trigger the freedom of the Bnei Yisrael. It would trigger the Exodus. That would be the plague that breaches the prison walls, and it is separate. It is different than the other plagues. That, from its initial concept, from the very beginning, was always meant to be the plague that set the Bnei Yisrael out of Egypt. The preceding 9 plagues filled a different role to educate the Jews, to educate Paro, and teach fundamental philosophical truths that we as Jews have to know, but also address Paro's mockery. So through a deliberate and systemic look, we've organized we've examined the organizational structure of the plagues, the language that's used, the narrative structure of these 2 parshios, and perhaps we've come up with a new textually based understanding of the role that the 10 plagues play. They were designed to teach theological lessons to both the Jewish people and the Egyptians, but at the same time, they're not necessarily to affect the Yetzias Mitzrayim, to affect the Exodus. That was perhaps the role or perhaps the lesson of the final plague, Makas Bechoros, as it was always conceived to be. So perhaps this actually provides additional depth to what exactly it is that we're commemorating when we sit at a Pesach Seder. We're not just remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim, but we're also remembering the mockery of Paro, the lessons that were taught, but also the lessons that we ourselves were meant to learn as we recount these specific plagues, Dam Tzvardeya, Kinim, Orov, Dever, Shchin, Barad, Arba, whatever it is, Choshech, Makas, Bechoros. It's all there to not only remember what transpired, but also to reflect and take lesson the meaning that we're supposed to suss out from the Makos, not just to remember what they did, what happened, but to also reflect what they mean and what was being communicated. All right, with that, we'll perhaps go back to the very beginning. What I wanted to start the class off with, which what I think is probably not as pressing or not as far-reaching, but let's talk a little bit about how the slavery began. The Ramban, as we've said in the previous class, defines the book of Shmos, the book of Exodus, as the book of exile and of redemption. It begins with the descent of Yaakov to Egypt. It talks about their families there, how they proliferated, how they grew, and then we shift almost immediately to the distrust of the Egyptians and the beginning of the slavery. But how did that slavery begin? What exactly transpired? What exactly was going on? So let's take a look here at source number 1. Let's take a look. We can perhaps ascertain something from the structure of the very first chapter of the book of Shmos, which does describe the slavery. It doesn't spend a lot of time talking about the slavery, what exactly it is that we did. Just some very vague terminology. But let's take a look at how it's all structured. So you have in source number 1, you have verses 1 through 7, the rapid expansion of the Bnei Israel. You have 12 sons, which become a family of 70 until the entire land is filled with them. We have slavery, forced labor. These are 2 stages of oppression through work. And then finally, we have 2 stages in the plan to kill the male children, first with the midwives, and then casting them all into the river. So it appears that what caused the Jewish people to fall into slavery or to incur the ire of the Egyptians was because, as you can see in the text, in text number 2, Bnei Yisrael paru v'yishritzu v'yirbu v'yatzmu v'ma'od ma'od v'timar mole ha'aretz osam. Joseph died, all of his brothers died, and the Jewish people were fertile and they were prolific and they multiplied and increased very greatly so that the land was full of them. Is it true that the land was full of them? I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily true, if there were so many of them. We do believe that there were a lot. But were they so numerous and so great as to create an actual risk to the Egyptians? Who knows? Possibly not. Maybe yes. Whatever the case may be, a person's perception is as great, if not more important, than their actual reality. A person's perception often becomes their reality. And you also see from the language here, you take a look, there are 7 words that are used to describe how the Jewish people expanded in number, that it's obvious that this is the source of Egyptian worry, because why would the Torah be stressing how prolific they were if not to explain what is about to happen or why things transpired? If you take a look, for example, let's see if I can find over here. Let's take a look at source number 7. We see that the Jewish people proliferated, and we also see that the Jewish people were distinct. Precisely the 2 blessings with which Israel were blessed in Egypt, the unusual growth rate and their distinctiveness, were the very cause of their enslavement. Herein is a message for all time. The very proliferation and distinctiveness, which are such a wonderful blessing for a people in their own land, because those were always the blessings that the avos, the patriarchs, always received, that their children will be as numerous as the stars in the sand. But that's only when we are independent and living in our own land. When we're not living in our own land, they can turn into a source of trouble and tragedy. Am Yisrael, who became formed as a nation in a foreign land, aroused hatred by their very existence. So we see here that whatever it was that that the Egyptians thought, whether or not it was justified or not, the very fact that Jewish people were proliferated and we were distinct became the source of our downfall. Something that's often a source of strength, at least in the context of Mitzrayim, and perhaps in other events in history, were the source of much pain and suffering. So how did the Jewish people fall into slavery? What exactly transpired? So here you have the Ramban, who lays things out. He says that Paro's initial plan from the very beginning was the extermination of the Jewish people. But at the same time, because he did not want to arouse the opposition of his colleagues, of his fellow Egyptians, he knew that that would be distasteful to the overwhelming majority of his citizens. He therefore set into motion a plan with the ultimate goal to arrive at the extermination of the Jewish people. The final solution was always part of the plan. He starts off with a work tax, the Ramban says. A work tax where we should be familiar with from the book of Kings, from the book of Malachim, as Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, built the temple and other structures through work levies, where individuals, members of the people representing for certain segments of the population, had to go and work for a period of time to build public structures. Well, now that the Jewish people were working in this manner, they were then consigned to slavery, where perhaps the levies were increased gradually, until ultimately they were declared, or they were decreed, to be slaves of the state. Now that they've been dehumanized, now in the eyes of the Egyptians, they have been so debased, there's no longer a shred of humanity in there. They're now this incredible other, this underclass, these troglodytes, this slave folk. Then it became easier to then approach the midwives and surreptitiously begin the extermination of the Jewish people. However, that fails, and therefore, at a point later on, he then turned to the outright and explicit murder of the Jewish people. According to the Ramban, there was a sequence of events with a plan in mind for a final solution. That's the Ramban. The Sforno, however, says something different, and I believe it's probably, at least to me, is probably closer to the truth, if anything. And it also teaches something about human nature. It allows us to perhaps absorb and to digest some parts of our own history that are still somewhat within living memory, and maybe can stand as a warning for the future. If we take a look at source number 9, we have the Sforno, where the Sforno says, V'ya'alem min haaretz me'atzmo. So over there, it's a little bit complicated how he arrives at this and how he gets there. But what he essentially says is that Paro's attempt was to not to destroy the Jewish people, but rather make their life so uncomfortable that they will leave of their own volition. He says, we can't kick them out. We can't expel them because then all of our neighbors are going to think poorly of us. So if we just make things so uncomfortable, maybe they'll just leave. And so he begins with the same order that the Ramban describes, a work levy. Eventually that becomes slavery. As he says, once the Egyptians observed how the Israelites debased themselves by performing menial labor, they decided to enslave them. The Jewish people kept getting messages, you're not wanted, we want you to leave. But because the Egyptians did not understand just how much the Jewish people at that time came to identify themselves with Egypt. This was their home. This is where they lived. This is where they've always lived. Therefore, they chose to debase themselves to the degree that ultimately they became slaves. According to the Sforno, the people were being made to feel uncomfortable, but they just didn't get the hint. They didn't get the message. They couldn't understand what exactly was happening. They would always comfort one another saying, well, this will only be temporary. It won't last. Things will get better soon. They came to identify themselves as being a part of Egyptian society, as part of Egypt. They so thoroughly identified themselves with Egypt that they could not conceptualize themselves as being anything else, anywhere else. Is the Sforno right? Well, the Sforno has to contend with a big problem because when we read later on, when Moshe goes to Paro and says, let our people go, Paro says no. If the entire enterprise was to, just get them all out, well, why didn't he just acquiesce and say, okay, you guys can go? Perhaps, they, just like the American South, their economy became so contingent and so reliant on slave labor that by that point, they could no longer do without the slaves. But what we see here, at least according to the Sforno, is a group of people who do not want to leave because of their love of Egypt and their identification with the country. Now, in our more recent history, we've had the painful irony of perhaps both explanations sort of playing out. Hitler was an expert in slowly tightening his grip on the Jewish people from propaganda to Nuremberg, to ghettos, to death camps. It was all a gradual process that perhaps created and dehumanized them in the eyes of the Germans, that it made it possible for the final solution. And on the other hand, we also see that there were Jews who felt so comfortable in Germany or wherever it was they were living that they just simply never had the desire to leave. Is this a lesson for our own times? Possibly it's a lesson. I don't know if it's playing out now or not. Who knows? It's probably will be something that we experience in the future until the coming of Mashiach. That's likely to be something that reoccurs. But we do see that this, as a historical precedent, has played out numerous times throughout our history. We've had people who have attempted to debase us to the degree that makes it easier for us to be persecuted, perhaps even killed, perhaps even murdered en masse. It's happened several times in our history. We also see that the Jewish people became so identified with where they themselves identified so closely with where they lived. They were prepared and content to make do with an awful, horrific situation or circumstance, and were not prepared to leave and move on. This is a lesson from our past that can perhaps allow us to understand historical events that have come subsequently and also stand as a warning to what might happen in the future. So several different ideas, several different concepts, several different things that one can take home and meditate on. But in essence, what have we discussed tonight? Well, we've spoken about the pedagogy of the 10 plagues, what their purpose was, what their meaning could possibly have been, the who the audience for the plagues had to have been, the Jewish people and Paro. We spoke about them in waves, each one coming with its own message, with its own meaning. And finally, also, we've explored two different ways of understanding the slavery in Egypt, how it was precipitated, how it came to be. We have the Ramban, who says that Paro was intending initially to exterminate the Jewish people. We have the Sforno, who says that not so. They just wanted us to leave, and we just didn't take the message. They're all valuable lessons that we can take, we can meditate on, and perhaps utilize and grow as we grow from in the future. And with that, I'm now open to questions, comments, or rebuttals. And I'll turn the recording off.